Hello and welcome to the origins of Islam. After learning about the various influences on the Quran in the last video, today we want to use that knowledge and try to narrow down who those writers of the Quran were and where they came from. So, what can we say about the writers of the Quran? We do know that they were fluent in both Arabic and Aramaic. Aramaic was the liturgical language in the East, just like Latin was the liturgical language of the Catholic Church in the West. From the Quran itself, we know that its writers wrote polemic texts against the Trinitarian Christians of their time. The tone of their texts suggests that they were written in opposition to the Church of the East, also known as the Nestorian Church, which adopted the Nicene Creed in 410 at the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon, which was the Persian equivalent to Nicaea under the Sassanid king Yazdegerd I. Since these polemics are so central, we are safe to assume that they were written by an Eastern Christian splinter group, a minority among these Christians. And the reason being, if you are a minority, you define yourself more in opposition to the majority than through your own beliefs. So them being anti-Trinitarian versus the Trinitarian Church of the East was really their main focus when writing the Proto-Quran. However, sometimes they also seem to attack the Greek Church instead, sometimes the Monophysite Gassanids. So those writers were aware of other forms of Trinitarian Christianity, but their main ideological enemy seems to have been the Church of the East. And of course, the people who wrote the Quran, the people of this Quranic movement, believed to live according to scripture as opposed to the other Christian groups, and that understanding was then documented in the Quran. Now let's try to narrow down where the writers of the Quran actually came from. So we know that it had to be a place where Arab Christians lived. It had to be a place with a dominant Nestorian church. It had to be a place where Monophysite Christianity, where Gnostics, where Buddhists, and where Zoroastrians were present, as we know from all those different influences on the Quran, which we have established in the previous episode. We also know that it had to be a place that matches plants, fruits, gardens, etc. mentioned in the Quran. And they must have lived in a place which is consistent with the language used in the Quran. And that language is the language of Eastern Syria. Given all those constraints, one thing that we know for sure is that the Quran must have been written in a large, buzzing population center with a diverse population. Only in a big metropolis would you get all those influences that we've seen. Based on those criteria, we can already say that Mecca and Medina match pretty much none of the above. I mean, there probably were Christians down there, maybe even Nestorians, but everything else just wasn't present. Those places weren't big metropolitan centers, they were rather small and insignificant. They are in the middle of the desert, so we do not have the plants, fruits, gardens, etc. It has the wrong language, the wrong dialect, and there clearly are no Buddhists or Zoroastrians anywhere near these places. Instead, everything points to Eastern Persia. And now I know you will immediately object and say, well, didn't you just say that the language was that of Eastern Syria? How come now you're saying everything points to Eastern Persia? Well, the reason is actually quite simple, and that is that we know of many deportations under the Sassanid kings. Hundreds of thousands of people from Syria, Cilicia, and Cappadocia were deported and moved into the east under King Shapur I alone, who reigned from 240 to 270 AD. And among them were many Christians. And then throughout the centuries, whenever there was a war between the Sassanid Empire and the Roman Empire, or then later the Byzantine Empire, there would have been deportations. Because what those Sassanid kings did was to build new cities to further their own glory, but then those cities would be empty and they needed to be filled. So then they would bring in people whom they would deport. And keep in mind, back then the world population was a lot smaller, so deporting hundreds of thousands during a single campaign is quite significant. And particularly under Khosrow I, who reigned from 531 to 579 AD. Once again, hundreds of thousands were deported, almost all of them Christians, and many of them Arabs. In the Quran, Khosrow I is actually referred to as the Pharaoh, and there's a parallel drawn between Khosrow and the deportees with the Pharaoh in the Old Testament and the Jews who have to live in the Egyptian exile. So it seems quite reasonable that the people who wrote the Quran were in fact deportees or descendants of deportees who lived under Khosrow I and who were hoping to return to the lands of their ancestors further to the west in Syria. and they compared themselves to those Israelites. They wanted to have their own exodus, or using the terminology of the Quran, they wanted to have their own hijrah. Now, the earliest Arab coins, they actually do come from the Far East, and on them we have the Abdallah motto, which means servant of God. And that was a title for Jesus, which was very common among Eastern Christians, not so much anymore in the West, where it fell out of favor centuries before. The one name that will come up again and again throughout my presentations is, of course, Abd al-Malik. He seems to be the linchpin of this Quranic movement. He propagated it in the West. He brought in a very strict Arabization policy in his empire, and he seems to have pushed the Quran or the theology of the Quran throughout his empire. Now, when we look at his coins, he's introduced there as Abd al-Malik Marwan, and not as Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, as later traditions tell us. So when we look at the hard evidence on the ground, the coins that we can dig up, he's Abd al-Malik Marwan. But then Marwan literally means from Merw. So that's this city that which this arrow points to in the far northeast of the Persian Empire. Interpreting Abd al-Malik as the son of Marwan is therefore a later misinterpretation. So what is that city, Merw? Nowadays, it's pretty much forgotten, at least in the West, because in 1221 AD, the Mongols completely destroyed the city. They killed everybody in it and burned down all the buildings, the libraries and everything, and it has been deserted since. However, before 1221, Merw was one of the largest cities in the world, and by that time, predominantly Christian and Buddhist. It's located on the Silk Road at an oasis, which means there was a lot of trade going through there. It attracted lots of people and merchants from both Persia and India. It was even briefly the seat of the entire Islamic Caliphate in the 9th century. And in Merw, we find all the influences that we also find in the Quran. We have these pre-Nicene Christian Arabs with their anti-Trinitarian beliefs. We have a strong Nestorian church who was getting a foothold there around that time. We have lots of Buddhist influences. In fact, Merw is the most Western city that we know of where there are Buddhist temples and settlements. We obviously have Persian influences. It's one of the holy sites in Zoroastrianism. And there were Gnostics. We know of Manichaeans there. So everything seems to fit. And with it being an oasis town, obviously we would also have all the fruits, plants and gardens described in the Quran. Before we move on, I want to still give you one disclaimer. Obviously, we are now talking about probabilities. So we do not have any smoking gun pointing towards Merw. But looking at the evidence, looking at all the influences, looking at the social and the political situation, looking at the coins and the trade and everything, Merw seems to be the place that is most likely where the writers of the Quran were active. There are some alternative theories. For example, another candidate is the region around what's on this map, Shiraz. So Shiraz is actually the place where the Sassanids come from. But this entire region here is called Persis, and that's another strong candidate for where the Quran comes from. It doesn't have all the influences like Merw does. So for instance, there are no permanent Buddhist settlements. Similarly, another candidate would be slightly further to the west around the city of Hira. So that's where my mouse pointer is right now. But neither of these candidates comes anywhere near Merw in terms of probability. And now let's go even more speculative. And let's try to answer the question when this proto-Quran was put together. Now here, as I just said, we are getting even more speculative. But we can still try to make an educated guess. The problem that we have is, of course, that we only have circumstantial evidence. And we do know from the different influences that the Quran contains very old elements. So last time we've seen some of these Jewish apocrypha which were written in the 1st century AD. But when were those elements put together? And now I'm going out on a limb here and I'll say that this proto-Quran or the core of the Quran, these oldest elements that we find in the Quran, they were probably compiled between 550 and 600 AD, so quite a bit earlier than we are told in the standard Islamic narrative. So what's my reasoning behind these dates? Well, we've already seen that Khosrow I was mentioned as Pharaoh within the Quran. So this proto-Quran must have been written either during or shortly after his reign. That is why I have 550 as a lower bound. And there's another reason, because around 550, the city of Merw became the seat for a metropolitan bishop of the Church of the East, which is sort of a marker for the Church of the East establishing itself there and trying to establish a church hierarchy and trying to include all the Christians that were already there within their church hierarchy, which then would be a trigger for people who do not share the same theology and the same Christology as the Church of the East to band together and to form an opposing group. And as we can see from all these polemical verses, that's exactly what has happened. So 550 as a lower bound. Now the upper bound I put here is 600, and that's already a bit more difficult to establish. But the reason is, from the text in this Proto-Quran, we can conclude that this Arab exodus or Arab hijra had not yet happened. And that on the contrary, we are looking at a Persian empire which is still fully functional, with people living in this exile comparing themselves to the Jews in their Egyptian exile. But then shortly after 600, the final war between the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire started. So it's likely that this Proto-Quran was written before the war started. Because with the start of the war, a lot of things change. And we can see a lot of movements. And we actually see the return of many of these Arab tribes to Syria. Therefore, my educated guess would be between 550 and 600, roughly. But just to make sure that everybody's clear on this, I'm talking about the Proto-Quran, the core of the Quran. So that's not the book itself. The Quran, as we've established in the very first video, must have been written over a longer period of time. I would argue that it didn't exist as a complete book until at least the late 8th century. What we're talking about here is maybe up to a third of what's nowadays considered the Quran. And this third consists mainly of early sermons that would have been read during church service. Or in other words, the lectionary that we talked about last time. And as I've put also on this slide, changes to the text were made until the 9th century, at least. So the Quran was still being worked on until the 9th century. Probably quite some time into the 9th century. And then the diacritics, those are these dots and dashes, they weren't finalized until the 10th or even the 11th century. And that's really when the reading was fixed. We are looking at a process that took maybe 500 years to complete. So from the original sermons, the original lectionary, all the way to the completed Quran, that was a long process. And it wasn't done in just a few decades as the standard Islamic narrative tells us. Now, before we end today's presentation, let me introduce you to this slide that I've created. So what we can see here is how those different Christian groups are interconnected. This is supposed to help us navigate the upcoming presentations. Let me just quickly explain what we are looking at here. And what we can see at the beginning are three main lines. We have the Catholics, which are basically the Greek Christians at the time. Well, Greek and Latin, but we're looking mainly at the Greek side of things here, because that's the context of where the Quran was written. We have those Syrian anti-Trinitarians. Those were Aramaic speakers. They were Semites. They included Arabs as well. That's their cultural background, and they would have rejected the Trinity. And then we have the Ebionites, who were also anti-Trinitarians, who come from a Jewish cultural background, who would have considered themselves Jews, but who would also have considered themselves to be Christians. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but they didn't believe that he was God. Also important to understand here are those gray lines, which connect the different streams here. And they do not represent people. Instead, they represent ideas. So for example, when you look at the Arians, they are connected to the Catholic stream and to the Syrian anti-Trinitarian stream, which doesn't mean that the Catholics and Syrians came together and formed a new group. It means that Syrian anti-Trinitarian ideas were merged with Catholic ideas to form the basic theology. I've also tried to color code this a little bit. So the different colors are supposed to show the different cultural background on which these streams evolved. I've already mentioned that this pink is the Greek cultural background. On top, the red, that's an Egyptian cultural background. Then those three bluish tones, those all come from an Aramaic cultural background. And in the bottom, the brownish one is a Jewish cultural background. And lastly, also the distances do somewhat represent theological distances. Not to scale, but it gives you an idea. So, for example, Arianism was quite close to the Syrian anti-Trinitarianism in terms of the theological understanding and quite far away from the Catholic understanding, whereas Nestorianism was quite close to the Catholic understanding and quite far away from the Syrian anti-Trinitarian understanding, even though Nestorianism also comes from this Aramaic-speaking background. And then obviously the Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christianity was very close to that of the Ebionites in terms of their theology, in terms of their Christology. So there isn't really much of a difference between the Syrian anti-Trinitarian Christians and the Ebionites. And then to the far right of this page, you can see how Islam is forming. And as I've mentioned before, it only really starts in the 9th century. That's when we see this new religion. But the seed is planted a lot earlier, so it branches off of this Syrian anti-Trinitarian branch in the late 6th century. As we said before, likely between 550 and 600 AD is when we first see an evolution away into its own direction. Although it's still very much Christian at that time, be it an anti-Trinitarian form of Christianity. Okay, I think we've spent enough time on this slide. We will see it again towards the end of my series, and then hopefully it will be a lot clearer. But for now, we've also come to the end of chapter 1 of my presentations. So that's why I want to summarize real quickly what we've seen so far. So in this chapter, we've gone through the critical Quran studies, which have been going on since the 19th century. We found out that the Quran is written in a mixed Syriac-Arabic language, and that this has led to many misreadings, some of which are these so-called dark passages, which are very obscure in their meaning. We have learned that the Quran is at its core a Christian lectionary. So this is this oldest third of the Quran, roughly third, which was presumably written between 550 and 600 AD. We've learned that it was written by Arabs in Persian exile, that the Quran has an anti-Trinitarian Christology, and that it was compiled over a lengthy period between the 6th and the 11th century. All right, and with that, we're at the end for today. Next time, we will have a broad look at the general timeline of historical events leading to the development of Islam as a new religion. Until then, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.